Hello, my name is Iris McAlpin Garrett. I'm an associate therapist in Northern California. And before becoming a therapist, I was a coach for over 13 years. And my professional training is mostly in complex trauma and grief and loss. So, all the light, fluffy things, that's my jam. And this channel is dedicated to answering your questions. So whether you subscribe to my email list or you leave comments below, I do prioritize my email list. But if you ask me questions, I will do my best to answer it. And if it's one I see a lot, I often give priority to those. And I might go rogue here and there and talk about some other topics, but that's what this channel is for. So thank you for joining me. In today's video, I'm going to be starting with a question from Chrissy. And I will post a longer version of her question in the description box. Provides a lot of context because Chrissy experienced a lot of trauma and abuse and betrayal in her early life, and that absolutely factors in to this question. So she asks, I want connection. I want to be close to people. I want good things in my life, but I end up pushing people away. And what gives? Why am I doing that? So before I dive into this fully, there's just something, this will apply to a lot of things, and I may end up repeating myself a lot with this over time. But if we go into trying to answer these questions from the place of adult logic, it really gets us in trouble, because it is true at face value. If we want connection, we shouldn't push people away. Makes sense. But we're kind of doing ourselves a disservice if we stop there, because we're not looking at it from the perspective of a child, and a child who was having to survive a really, really difficult situation, an impossible situation, really. So if we start to put ourselves in the shoes of the child, things start to make a lot more sense. So let's just imagine you're 5 years old, just for the sake of illustrating this. Say you're 5 years old. Most people in the United States, at least, stay at home until they're 18 years old. So if you're 5, that means you're stuck in that traumatic environment for another 13 years. That's more than twice the amount of time you've been alive. So let's just say if you're watching this right now, you're 25. That's like being in a traumatic environment until you're 65 years old. That is a really, really long time. We don't even like to wait a week for shipping, so we pay money to Amazon for Amazon Prime. This is a really long time, kind of unfathomably long, and especially to a child that doesn't have access to long-term thinking and hasn't really developed that felt sense of how time passes. You might as well say forever. So if you feel like you are trapped forever in a traumatic environment, then you're going to have to do some internal gymnastics and come up with some really brilliant strategies to survive that. So how do we do that? How are we going to survive if we're trapped forever in a terrible situation? For most people, if you're being mistreated, neglected, abused by the adults in your environment, it's really scary to believe that they're the bad one and you're the good one. Why? Because if you imagine that, you're basically telling yourself that you are screwed forever. You're just screwed. Because if they're bad, then there's really nothing we can do to make the situation better. So we're going to have to convince ourselves that we are defective or deficient or bad in some way. We're too much this, we're not enough that. And this sounds like terrible news, but it's not, because if we can really convince ourselves of this, then we can maintain a sense of hope, which is essential for a child to survive in this situation, to not just completely shut down and collapse. So we tell ourselves, maybe if I can just be a really good boy or a really good girl, I won't be screamed at. Maybe if I can just make myself less attractive, I won't be a target for abuse. Or maybe if I can just learn how to read my parents' emotions better and just scan the room and figure out where everyone is, then I won't get hit. There are so many ways we might be able to feel a greater sense of control and a greater sense of hope if there is something wrong with us that we might be able to fix. And for most of us, we make these assessments very early in life. And it's not like just this conscious decision, like I'm going to decide that I'm bad and then I'm going to maintain a sense of control and hope. It doesn't quite work like that. It's part of our natural instinctive survival mechanisms to assess things this way. So we're very, very intelligent creatures, and we figure out what we need in order to manage unmanageable situations. But regardless, when we do this really, really young, it's like we forget that there was ever another way of viewing the situation. And maybe we never even really allowed ourselves to consider for a moment that our parents were, or our caregivers were the ones who were at fault, and that we were actually good. And so this just becomes the truth for us. It's like the water that we swim in. And if this happens early enough, our entire view of the world gets built around this truth that we're bad. So if to us it's really true that we're bad and defective, and we've convinced ourselves of that, then connecting with others is going to be terrifying, because God forbid they actually like us, and then we're just sitting there terrified, wondering when they're going to figure it out. It's like, when are they going to figure out that I am damaged goods? And then we're just constantly second guessing ourselves and reading them, trying to figure out, did they figure it out yet? Did they figure it out yet? And that is just a terrible place to be. And so if it feels like that or pushing them away are our only options, then pushing them away is a fairly reasonable way to deal with that. At least we feel a sense of control, whereas waiting for them to discover our badness is once again out of control. And not only that, but the more someone likes us, the more we have to kind of bat that away, because it threatens that view of our badness that we had to cling to in order to survive that early situation. So this is why we might choose partners that mistreat us and then run from people who actually like us. This allows us to maintain cover as the bad one who deserves mistreatment, which felt so incredibly necessary. But here's the thing. It was always a cover. You were never the bad one. You were never the bad one. Not even for a second. You just had to convince yourself that you were, to avoid being buried under the crushing weight of the grief, the pain, the hopelessness of being mistreated by the people that you depended on. So what do we do with this? Okay, valid next question. I wish I could say that knowing this intellectually was enough, or that hearing me say this would be enough. I know it's usually not enough to just hear someone say that you're not the bad one and that you never were. It is true. I will stand by that to my death, but it's often not enough. And it takes a lot of time to allow yourself to believe that, because it took time for you to have to convince yourself of that. And when trauma happens through connection, like through our relationships with others, it's often relationships with others that allow us to heal. So maybe this is a friend who you've known long enough, who's seen all of your, flaws and still wants to hang out with you, or a significant other who has persevered through your attempts to push them away, or a therapist, who can sit and listen and be with you and not reject you no matter what you bring into the session. So if you're lucky, you have all three of those things, but it can really start anywhere. And all three of those have certainly helped me at different times. And I also believe that learning about trauma helps a lot, which you're doing right now, which is great, because it starts to help us realize that the thoughts that we've had, the feelings that we've had, the ways that we've coped, the things that we had to do to get through each day as a young person were actually normal, and sometimes even expected if we experienced early trauma. Again, knowing these things doesn't just make them disappear, but over time, it can start to soften the way that we relate to ourselves, and maybe just give us a glimmer of self-compassion, which is all we need to get started. So Chrissy, I hope hearing it laid out this way makes sense to you. I hope it's helpful to you in some way. I really appreciate you taking the time to ask the question and to reach out.